Being one of the most famous gaming franchises in history, the Final Fantasy series has become legendary with many gaming fans for the various inspirations it's had on the rest of the industry. However, there are some complaints that fans of the Final Fantasy franchise have had at different times due to the changing difficulty of the games. Final Fantasy has always been primarily about storytelling, creating amazing worlds and characters in which players can lose themselves. But for such long games, challenging combat is also a hugely important aspect, and as such, the Final Fantasy games are often judged by fans for how hard they can make themselves. With that being said, welcome back to Game Rant. My name is Casey, and today we're going to be going over the 7 easiest Final Fantasy games. Starting our list off at number 7, we've got Final Fantasy IX. Many consider Final Fantasy IX to be a lesser entry in the franchise, but it was a great return to what made the franchise great from the beginning that still deserves a remake at some point. It was a wonderfully fun entry that should be better remembered than it actually is within the franchise. Although it isn't as easy as some of the entries which directly predated it, there is still a mediocre level of challenge to this edition. Though there is a particularly tough final dungeon, the majority of the dungeons that players have to traverse are reasonably easy besides that. There are a few challenging super bosses throughout, but the majority of the combat faced in this entry really won't challenge most players, particularly those used to this style of play. At number 6, we've got Final Fantasy XII. Some entries in the Final Fantasy franchise find their difficulty in old-school combat systems and controls, but others found it in the grind that the combat presented. However, Final Fantasy XII is one of the entries where players have to traverse the largest number of enemies and still manage not to present many challenges. Final Fantasy XII is one of the more interesting entries since the franchise was attempting to completely change itself after other recent entries were criticized for being too similar. These changes made the game somewhat easier than some of the surrounding entries. Though it still provided some level of challenge, the only real difficulty was in slogging through the many battles. Not gonna lie though, it would be pretty exciting to see a remake done for this entry as well. At number 5, we've got Final Fantasy VII. The most famous entry in the Final Fantasy franchise isn't as easy as some of the others, but overall, this is such a well-beloved game because it reduced the difficulty from many of the other entries that came before it. Squaresoft really wanted this game to be a hit in the West, so they reduced the difficulty and it worked out well for them. There was no particularly game-breaking aspect or method in Final Fantasy VII. It just kept the general combat systems easy to learn and not too difficult to master. However, most fans merely suggest that the difficulty is a bit low overall compared to what they prefer, as opposed to being ridiculously low. The many different versions of this game continue to lessen the difficulty even further additionally. At number 4, we've got Final Fantasy VI. The story of Final Fantasy VI helped level the franchise to a place where Squaresoft could bank on the reliability of the next entry, even in the West. However, this was definitely the entry that began to define the franchise in other ways, including a reduction in difficulty that mostly came from adding more party members and them making such a huge difference. The party being larger meant that the entire combat system became a lot easier to deal with throughout the game from when players had just a few added to their party. Unfortunately, the balance between adding members and the combat struggle would never really be perfect in the franchise's later entries, though the pixel remaster of this one still holds up as a beautifully fun retro playthrough. At number 3, we've got Final Fantasy VIII. The big problem with the difficulty in Final Fantasy VIII is that the developers attempted to add a junction system that allowed players to augment their stats with magic. While this introduced an interesting level of strategy to a format that didn't previously offer much in that direction, it made the game far too easy for players. As soon as players began figuring out how to overpower their characters using the system, they found out that Final Fantasy VIII was going to be a ridiculously easy experience unless they specifically geared their upgrades towards making it harder for themselves. This was unfortunate, and coupled with the enemies that leveled with the party, this made much of the game a fairly silly experience. At number 2, we've got Final Fantasy XV. The challenge in Final Fantasy XV is incredibly low, prompting a message from the developers that this is a game for Final Fantasy longtime fans as well as complete newcomers to the franchise. Whether fans were really able to enjoy the fighting aspects with the difficulty so low is up to each fan themselves to answer. Final Fantasy XV was a huge success and kept the franchise going comfortably, but players found themselves getting away with bad play a lot of the time without punishment. There were so many consumables available, and the healing systems were so overpowered that it was unquestionably the easiest game in the Final Fantasy franchise at the time. And taking our top spot as the easiest Final Fantasy game in the franchise, Final Fantasy XVI. Without a doubt, the easiest of the lot is the most recent entry in the Final Fantasy franchise. Continuing with the focus on accessibility that was exhibited greatly throughout Final Fantasy XV, many gamers that love the JRPG franchise for the challenging combat found themselves frustrated once again by this new entry. As with any game, there are ways for players to make the experience more challenging for themselves. But there are options such as items that can be equipped that will automatically engage in complex move combinations for players without them having to do those themselves. This helps makes the combat throughout most of Final Fantasy XVI simple in comparison to many older entries, hands down making it the easiest entry in this franchise. And there you have it, the easiest Final Fantasy games ranked. Let us know in the comments what are your favorite Final Fantasy games and which ones you found to be the easiest. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, be sure to visit GameRant.com for more top-notch gaming content. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care for now.